Into the fires of hell they are gone, a hero to be. Enter the war from over the sea, intervene 1918, all the way from Tennessee. Hill 223. Can't believe I'm standing here right now. This is amazing. The day after the Lost Battalion was found here in the Argonne Forest, one of the most remarkable stories of the Great War took place. However, while the Lost Battalion's story made national headlines almost instantly, as it happened in real time, the story of Hill 223 wasn't as widely known until well after the war ended. It's the story of how a man who initially tried to get out of fighting in the war ended up an American legend. Alvin Cullum York was born in 1887 in a log cabin in Tennessee, very near to the Kentucky border. He came from a very poor family, a family of 11 children. He had very little education because his father needed him, like so many fathers on so many farms, to work the family farm. He also was needed to hunt and fish to help feed the family. When Alvin's father died in 1911, he helped his mother raise his younger siblings. To supplement the family's income, Alvin went to work in a railroad construction job, and then later on as a logger. By all accounts, he was a skilled laborer who devoted himself to the welfare of his family, and he was also a crack shot. York, on top of all those other things, was a violent alcoholic who was prone to getting into fights in local saloons. And it was in one of those saloon fights that one of his best friends was killed. And it was after that friend's death, and partially due to the influence of his mother, that Alvin York became a committed Christian and also an avowed pacifist. On June 5th, 1917, at the age of 29, Alvin York registered for the draft, as all men between the ages of 21 and 30 were required to do. But when he got to the question that asked if he had any exemptions that he wanted to claim from the draft, men would write things like an injury that they had or a reason why they couldn't fight. And he wrote, "Yes, don't want to fight." When that initial claim for conscientious objector status was denied, he appealed the decision, citing his religious faith as a member of a pacifist denomination of Christianity. But here's the thing. During World War I, conscientious objector status did not exempt the objector from military duty. Those individuals could still be drafted. They were just simply given assignments that did not involve combat, and so would not conflict with their anti-war principles. In November of 1917, while York's application was still being considered, he was drafted, and he began his Army service at Camp Gordon in Georgia. From the day he registered for the draft until he returned from the war on May 29, 1919, Alvin York kept a diary of his experiences. A lot of what we know about his life and about his story comes from that diary. In his diary, York wrote that he refused to sign documents provided by his pastor that would help him get a discharge on religious grounds, and similar documents provided by his mother asserting a claim of exemption as the sole support of his mother and siblings. These were legitimate excuses to get out of the war, and Alvin claimed that he didn't want out of the war. So despite his initial signed request for an exemption, Alvin York apparently later rejected the idea that he was ever a conscientious objector. He served in Company G of the 328th Infantry, which was a part of the 82nd Division. It is known today as the 82nd Airborne, but at the time it was simply the 82nd Division, or the 82nd Infantry Division. Alvin York was deeply troubled by the conflict between his pacifism and his ongoing training for war. And so he spoke at length with his company commander, a man named Captain Edward Danforth, as well as with his battalion commander, Major G. Edward Buxton, who himself was a devout Christian. Danforth was the one who seems to have successfully persuaded Alvin York that he could be both a committed Christian and also a warrior on the battlefield. Alvin was granted a 10-day leave to visit home. And something must have happened while he was at home, because when he returned, he was convinced that God meant for him to fight and would keep him safe in the process. Traveling to Boston, Alvin York's unit set sail for Le Havre, France in May of 1918 and arrived later that month after a stopover in Britain. When they reached the continent, the 82nd spent some time along the Somme as well as a few other places as they underwent additional training to prepare them for combat operations along the Western Front. Alvin was promoted to corporal, and he took part in the Somme-Hel offensive that September as the 82nd sought to protect the U.S. Army's right flank. With the successful conclusion of fighting in that sector, the 82nd shifted northward to take part in the largest battle in the history of the U.S. military, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Entering fighting on October 7th to relieve the units of the 28th Infantry Division, York's unit received orders that night to advance that next morning to take Hill 223, which is right here behind me. And then they were to press on to the Decauville Road north of Chatel-Chéhéry, which is just on the other side of this hill. It's where I'm parked, actually. They advanced around 6 a.m., and the next morning, the Americans succeeded in taking the hill. Moving forward from the hill, York's unit was forced to attack through this triangular valley that I'm standing in now, and they quickly came under German machine gun fire from several sides from the adjacent hills. I'll turn around and let you look because you can see that. As they did, the Americans began taking heavy casualties. In an effort to eliminate the machine guns, 17 men led by Sergeant Bernard Early, including York, were ordered to work around the German rear, taking advantage of the brush and the hilly nature of this terrain. The troops succeeded in slipping behind the German lines and advanced up one of these other hills, opposite the American advance. In doing so, they overran and captured a German headquarters area and secured a number of prisoners, including a German major. While Early's men began to secure those prisoners, though, the German machine gunners up the slope turned several of their guns and opened fire on the Americans who had been successful to that point. This killed 6 and wounded 3, including Early. That left Alvin York in command of the remaining 7 men. With his men behind cover guarding the prisoners they had already taken, Alvin York moved to deal with the machine guns. Alvin York wrote later in his journal about what happened next. He said, "The Germans got us, and they got us right smart. They just stopped us dead in our tracks. Their machine guns were up there on the heights overlooking us and well hidden, and we couldn't tell for certain where the terrible heavy fire was coming from. And I'm telling you, they were shooting straight. And if anybody knew what straight shooting looked like, it was Alvin York. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home. Our attack just faded out. And there we were, lying down about halfway across the valley, and those German machine guns and big shells getting us hard. He goes on to say, those machine guns were spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth all around me, something awful. You could just imagine the machine gun fire just mowing the grass in front of him and knowing what that would do to your body. He said the Germans were yelling orders. You never heard such a racket in all your life. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into the brush. As soon as the machine guns opened fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. See, Alvin York is always thinking about what to do. He's cool under fire. That's something you get a picture of in what he's writing. He said there were 30 of them in continuous action, and all I could do was touch the Germans off just as fast as I could. I was sharp shooting. All the time I kept yelling at them to come down. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to. But it was they or I. And I was giving them the best I had. I'm a little out of breath, but I made it. I'm in the approximate location of the German machine gun nest, the famous one from the story of Alvin York and Hill 223. If the story happened on flat ground, it's incredible. When you come here and you see that the German machine gun nest is a good 100 feet up a hill, a pretty steep hill that's difficult to run without carrying equipment, without being shot at. When you see that this is what Alvin York came up against, blows my mind, absolutely blows my mind. This is where the German machine gun nest was. So let's get a look down the hill. Alvin York came from over there. Impressive. So beginning in a prone position, Alvin York utilized the skills that he learned as a boy. He picked off the German gunners, which were right here. And York was able to move to a standing position as he evaded the enemy fire. During the course of the fight, 6 German soldiers emerged from their trenches up here and charged down the hill toward Alvin York with bayonets. He was running low on rifle ammunition at this point, so he drew his pistol and he dropped all 6 of them before they reached him. Then he switched back to his rifle and returned to sniping at the German machine guns. Believing he had killed around 20 Germans and not wanting to kill any more than was necessary, York began calling for them to surrender. In this, he was aided by the captured major down the hill, who ordered his men to cease fighting. They rounded up the prisoners in the immediate area and York and his men realized that they had captured around 100 Germans. With the major's assistance, York began moving the men back toward the American lines, which would be in that direction. Along the way, another 30 Germans were captured. Advancing through artillery fire through this valley, York and the surviving men delivered 132 prisoners to battalion headquarters back in town. With that done, he and his men just went back to their unit and went back to fighting. It wasn't like Alvin York had this big celebration and suddenly he was a hero. They were in the middle of combat. They were in the middle of an ongoing operation. And so Alvin York did what he did, and then he went back to fighting. And it was only later on that all the praise came for him. It was many months later before he was even really being seriously considered for the Medal of Honor. Okay, this is a little bit weird, a little bit scary actually. Down here at the bottom of this sign, which I know is relatively recent, it says Bill Rudge Ministries. I knew Bill Rudge when I lived in Western Pennsylvania. He lived in the same town as me. I knew his family. We did ministry events together. This is crazy to see his name here. Wow. So like a lot of places on a lot of battlefields, I think the big difference between how Hill 223 looks today compared to how it looked at the time are the trees. The photos I've seen of Hill 223, including the ones with Alvin York standing in front of it, show a fairly barren hillside that didn't have any trees on it, and that makes total sense. An army consumes a lot of wood for firewood, for constructing fortifications, for making roads, sometimes plank roads. And so it makes sense that if an army spent any time at all in this location, there wouldn't have been any trees of any significance available on the battlefield. As I continue my walk back to my car, it's about a mile away, a little bit more about the story. Alvin York was eager to return home to Tennessee. He got married to Gracie Williams that June after the war ended, and over the next several years, the couple had 10 children together. 8 of them survived infancy. Alvin York was one of several veterans who served as pallbearers for the unknown soldier at the funeral in 1921. He also took part in several speaking tours and worked to improve educational opportunities for children in his native rural Tennessee who had very little education. Though he did have some political ambitions, they never really amounted to anything. Finally, in 1941, he relented and allowed a film to be made about his life. As the conflict, World War II in Europe, had increased in intensity, what had first been planned as a movie about his work to educate children in Tennessee actually got turned into a propaganda statement for intervention in World War II. It was starring Gary Cooper, who won his only Academy Award for his portrayal of Sergeant York, which is what the name of the movie was called.
had your thumb sticking straight up in the air, just like that.
Oh, yeah, that gives me balance.
Oh, it gives you balance, does it? You ready? Aim. Fire.
How?
They won't get me. I'll go back in them hills.
You ain't even put hounds on your trail in 40, no matter how far back you go.
Then they better not catch up with me, or they'll be a wishing they hadn't.
York, take over. The only non-com left.
The rest of you keep under cover.
Come back here. Where are you going?
You didn't give me command.
Alvin York was a consultant on that movie to make sure they got things right. He became a colonel in the 7th Regiment of the Tennessee Guard, and he became a spokesperson for the Fight for Freedom Committee, which was formed as a counter to Charles Lindbergh, who had an America First isolationist committee. He actually attempted to re-enlist when World War II broke out, but he was turned away because of his age and his weight. Since he was unable to serve in combat, he did play a role on bond and inspection tours.
It's not your creed or your height, nor the color of your eyes that makes an American. It's our freedom and equality over the Constitution and our Bill of Rights that makes an American an almighty fighter. We doughboys didn't realize then, and some of the men in the higher places didn't realize, that freedom is not a thing you can win once and for all.
Unfortunately, in his last years, he was plagued by financial and health problems, and he passed away in Nashville in 1964. His funeral was attended by a number of dignitaries, including General Matthew Ridgway, who came as a representative of President Lyndon Johnson. Among the many commands that Matthew Ridgway had over the years was the 82nd Division in World War II, the same division that was made famous by men like Alvin York.